It appears to most reasonable observers that Donald Trump was punked on the world stage by the Chinese Communist Party.
House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries slamming the president over his negotiations with China. So what did and didn't get accomplished when Presidents Trump and Xi met face to face? Well, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent was there. Now he's here and joins us with details. Welcome back, Mr. Secretary.
Shannon, good to see you.
What do you make of his characterization of what happened in China?
I think it's ignorant, and I think it's kind of sad he has no idea how ignorant he is, because I was in the room, and I can tell you I was there for the president's entire trip, and it was a tour de force. President went into Malaysia, signed trade deals, peace deals with Thailand and Cambodia, that everyone in the Asia region wants to be partners with the U.S. We moved on to Japan. The president and the new prime minister of Japan had great chemistry. And then we went into Korea, and the meeting with President Xi was one of great respect and many accomplishments.
Okay, so let's talk through some of those. First of all, there was this understanding or idea that the administration was hoping China's economy, which has been struggling, would be in a worse position even than it is. The Washington Post writing this: China's economy has proved more resilient than Trump officials anticipated. Chinese negotiators also demonstrated a willingness to hit back that seemed to surprise members of the administration, including Bessent, who visibly bristled at Beijing's retaliation. What do you make of their characterization of you?
Highly inaccurate. And look, we saw that the Chinese manufacturing has been down for 7 months in a row. So let's do the math. The Liberation Day, April 2nd. Where are we today? November 2nd. 7 months. Chinese manufacturing's been down every month. What they've done is the U.S. put up a tariff wall, and they have sent their goods to the rest of the world. Their trade with Europe is up 10%, but it's all discounted. They've depreciated their currency. And the Chinese economy, they're in the middle of a real estate crisis. They're trying to export their way out of it. And I think what we're going to see is the rest of the world is going to join us in the tariff wall against China. The EU recently put up 50% tariffs. So, no, I didn't bristle at all. What I was surprised at was that the Chinese on October 8th tried to put in rare earth controls on the entire world. And I said that it was a mistake because it was China versus the world, and President Trump was the leader of the free world, and we had those controls postponed for a year.
So let's talk about that. It's a year postponement. Do we have the ability to scale up what we need within that year in case a year from now there are tough negotiations and China decides to threaten to cut us off again?
Well, a couple of things, Shannon. One was President Trump threatened to put 100% additional tariffs on China, which gave me and our team great negotiating leverage in Kuala Lumpur before the president's meeting in Korea. So we had maximum leverage against the Chinese, and we could threaten the tariffs again, and we have plenty of things that we can hold back too. Over the next 12 and 24 months, we're going to be moving at warp speed. We didn't get here in a year. This is a problem that has been with us for several decades. It's never been addressed with these rare earths, the rare earth magnets. The Chinese have cornered the market, and unfortunately, at times, they prove to be unreliable partners. I think, and I hope, after the agreement and the goodwill between President Xi and President Trump in Korea, that we can depend on them to be more reliable partners, and the rest of the world can depend on them. But we can't take that chance. We don't want to decouple with China, but we're going to have to de-risk. So
do we trust them on the issue of fentanyl? Because there have been promises in the past about their production or control of the production of the precursors of fentanyl. I understand there's some agreement this time around. What are the teeth? Is it enforceable?
President Trump in the spring put 20% tariffs on the on China, on fentanyl. We took half of them off as a show of good faith. The Chinese have said that they will work on stopping the flow of precursors to North America that flow into Canada, into Mexico, where they're made into fentanyl, killing hundreds of thousands of U.S. citizens, ruining families, ruining lives. And what we're going to do is we're going to set up a very strict quantitative criteria, and we'll revisit it in 6 or 12 months to see whether they've accomplished it. And my sense is the tariffs could go up or down. I hope that the Chinese, for the sake of the American people, will live up to this, and we could see a dramatic drop in fentanyl deaths.
Okay, to the point of tariffs, a big test at the Supreme Court this week. A case on Wednesday will be argued about what is the bulk of the president's tariffs so far. One of the amicus briefs, or front of the court briefs that was filed, says this: the president's exercise of power here is either outside the scope of the power granted by Congress through IEPA, and that's the emergency powers law that the president used, or that the law is an unconstitutional delegation of power reserved exclusively to the legislative branch. So they argue either the president doesn't have the power to do it, or if Congress gave him the power, that was an unconstitutional delegation. You've lost in the lower courts so far. How do you game out Tuesday's or Wednesday's argument?
I'm quite optimistic, and Shannon, what I can tell you is that because of what the Chinese did on October 8th, threatening to put export controls on any rare earth products that they produce that had 0.01% of rare earths produced in China, that they were going to try to control those, and the president was able to push back using his IEPA powers. If that's not use of an emergency power, at an emergency time, I don't know what is. And then we go back to the spring, this terrible fentanyl crisis. You know, it's an emergency for what's going on, and we got a solution. The Chinese, thanks to the tariffs, came to the table. So I think just those two alone have shown us that the president has used it responsibly. And then on the third part, with the reciprocal tariffs, you know, there's something called a tipping point, and these trade deficits that we've had for years, 20, 30 years, especially since the China shock in the early 2000s, we were close to a breaking point, and the president did not want us to get there. You know, imagine if someone had held their hand up in 2006, 2007 and said, we're on the verge of a housing crisis. Well, President Trump raised his hand and said, we are on the verge of a balance of payments crisis, a trade crisis, and I'm going to use IEPA. That is what emergency powers are for.
Okay, if you lose, something you have to consider, Bloomberg reports this, should that happen, the government could owe the bulk of the $165 billion in customs duties collected so far this year, this fiscal year, back to the companies that paid them. So what is the plan if that happens?
Well, again, I think the Bloomberg analysis is wrong, and we'll cross that bridge when we come to it, because many of the tariffs are also collected under 232s and Section 301s, which have nothing to do with IEPA.
There are other tariff levers the president can use.
Yes.
Quickly, the president said he's got an apology from the Canadian Prime Minister about an anti-tariff ad that ran there using some old footage of President Reagan. But he says the trade talks are not back on. How do they get back on with Canada?
We'll see. I don't know about you, Shannon, but many of my worst fights have been with family members. We eventually make up. But you know, this was very serious. This Prime Minister of Ontario, who I imagine is smarting quite a bit from the Blue Jays' loss last night, spent, I heard, $75 million broadcasting across the U.S. border trying to sway public opinion. Now, if we're upset about what happens during foreign interference in our elections, this is foreign interference in U.S. public policy, and you know, I agree with President Trump 100%. A price has got to be paid for this. So, you know, over time, we'll see what happens.
Well, we'll watch to see if they kiss and make up, as family members often do. Thank you very much, Secretary. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Let's turn to trade, because that's been obviously your focus for several weeks. You're just back from China. President Trump called the summit with President Xi a great success. China's biggest concession was it suspended the export controls on these rare earth minerals that were used for our phones and other things. Trump said this settled the issue. The conservative Wall Street Journal editorial board, however, says the deal mostly restores the status quo that prevailed in May, and that if Mr. Trump wants to deter Chinese mercantilism, he needs a new strategy and more allies. What's your response to their view of this?
Well, I couldn't disagree with that more. Jake, what are the sources of U.S. strength, and how does China view us? We're the greatest military power in the world. Number two, we have the greatest economy. We have the reserve currency. And number three, it's our innovation and technology. And everything that came out of the conference between President Trump and President Xi, they gave the U.S. more leverage. Now, China has invoked this rare earth export regime. They did it once on April 4th for rare earth magnets, and they tried it again on October 8th. On October 8th, the president very forcefully pushed back. He threatened to add 100% tariffs to Chinese products, and we were able to negotiate a one-year pushback or a one-year suspension for this licensing regime. And the licensing regime, let me tell you, it's for everything that contains rare earths produced in China that has 0.01%. It was completely unworkable. And Jake, it wasn't the US versus China, it's China versus the world. They put it on the whole world, and the whole world pushed back. President Trump, the leader of the free world, they pushed back on behalf of the whole world.
So, but you disagree with the assessment that all this deal really does is reset things to where they were in May before a lot of this trade war began?
Well, I think it's naive for the Wall Street Journal editorial board, who I call a bunch of grumpy old men, to think that the Chinese weren't going to roll out these rare earth restrictions. They've been putting this plan together for 25, 30 years, and the U.S. has been asleep at the switch. And now this administration, we're going to go at warp speed over the next 1-2 years, and we're going to get out from under this sword that the Chinese have over us, and they have it over the whole world. And this time, we have rallied the allies, and so it is going to be all the Western democracies, the Asian democracies, and India are also going to join us in this, in trying to form our own supply chains. We don't want to decouple from China, but we need to de-risk. They've shown themselves to be an unreliable partner in many areas.
Let's talk about this week, because on Wednesday, the Supreme Court is going to hear arguments in two cases related to President Trump's tariffs. First of all, is President Trump planning on attending the oral arguments? And second of all, given the fact that tariffs are the province of Congress according to the Constitution, even though there is this exception for emergency tariffs, what makes you think that you guys will win this case?
Because the president is implementing the tariffs under an emergency authority, and I actually think that the Chinese actions on October 8th, by threatening the entire world with rare earth export controls that could have slowed down or shut down the Western manufacturing system, by the threatening 100% tariffs, under the IEEPA authority, the president was able to get the Chinese to delay this. So if that's not an emergency, I don't know what is. But Jake, if we look back to the spring, the president put 20% fentanyl tariffs on China, and now brought China to the table. They are going to make an earnest effort to stop sending precursor drugs to North America, killing hundreds of thousands of Americans every year. And if the fentanyl deaths are not an emergency, I don't know what is. So he is using these powers under an emergency act, and those are all emergencies.
Is President Trump going to be at the court on Wednesday?
I haven't seen his schedule.
You haven't seen his schedule. Are you going to be there?
Sorry?
Are you going to go?
I'm not planning on going.
You're not planning on going. President Obama is out on the campaign trail, and not surprisingly, he's been pretty critical of President Trump. Take a listen.
He has been focused on some critical issues like paving over the Rose Garden so folks don't get mud on their shoes, and building a $300 million ballroom. And if you don't get an invitation to the next White House shindig, you can always watch the festivities on Trump's live feed on Truth Social.
Now, these comments came within a day of the president hosting a Gatsby, pardon me, a Gatsby-themed Halloween party at Mar-a-Lago while SNAP benefits are set to run out. And you can understand the general theme. I've heard Republicans even express concern about the general optics here of parties and lavish ballrooms and such, while a lot of Americans are hurting. What's your response?
My response is that the Democrats should reopen the government. And, you know, I believe President Obama played a record amount of golf of any president. So, you know, I'm not sure why he's out there throwing stones. And, you know, that it's unfortunate. We've got 52 Republican senators who have voted to reopen the government, 3 brave Democrats, and I'm calling here on 5 moderate Democrats to be heroes. Let's reopen the government.
This week, the Fed voted to lower interest rates another 1/4 of a point to its lowest level in 3 years. However, the central bank's newest official, Stephen Myron, is warning that if the Fed doesn't continue to lower interest rates rapidly, the U.S. could face a recession. Do you agree that the U.S. is at risk of facing a recession?
I believe that we are in a transition period here, as we are seeing the Trump administration has cut back on government spending, Jake. What has gone unnoticed during the shutdown is for the fiscal year that ends September 30th, the government spent less than it did the year before, and because the GDP grew, the GDP, which had been 6.4, the deficit to GDP, which had been 6.4, 6.5% deficit, the highest when we weren't at war, weren't in a recession ever, we were able to bring it down to 5.9%. So we are bringing down government spending, and I would think that the Fed would want to assist with that, because if we go back and look, MIT just published a study that said 42% of the great inflation of 2022 came from excess government spending. So if we are contracting spending, then I would think inflation would be dropping. If inflation is dropping, then the Fed should be cutting rates.
But do you think that the U.S. is at risk of a recession if the Fed does not continue to drop rates?
I think that we are in good shape, but I think that there are sectors of the economy that are in recession, and you know, the Fed has caused a lot of distributional problems with their policies. I wrote a 7,000-word essay on that. You know, we've seen the biggest hindrance for housing here that are mortgage rates. So, you know, if the Fed brings down mortgage rates, then they can end this housing recession. Low-end consumers who have gotten killed under President Biden, these high rates are hurting them because they have debt, not assets. So I think that there are sections of the economy that could go into recession.
All right, Secretary Besson, thank you so much. We really appreciate you being here.